Today we're very lucky to have David Card open this conversation, and he'll be sharing his knowledge with us around global immigration inflows and their effects. And also he'll be helping us to understand the drivers of anti-immigration sentiment. David, as you probably know, is a Berkeley professor in California, and he's also the lead labor economist in the US. He's a global expert on immigration economics, and he was also recently elected to the US National Academy of Science. After David's presentation, we'll be joined on stage by Dave Murray, Julie Fry, and Nicholas Green, and they're going to talk about David's presentation briefly, and then we'll open it up to the audience for participation and questions. So please think with us and have plenty of questions ready. So once again, I'd like to thank you very much all for joining us today, and I'd like to hand it over to David Card, beaming in. Hello, David.
Hello.
Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I guess I'll just start sharing my screen and go right into it. I'm going to give a very quick overview of a bunch of different issues. As Ruth said, immigration is a controversial issue. It's also one of the most polarizing topics in many countries. This may be less of a concern in New Zealand, but in many countries, including the US, it's a sort of a signature issue for the populist right. And many of the concerns about immigration are related to economic issues and outcomes. So it's possible that some combination of economic theorizing and econometric evidence can help understand the background issues. This is my agenda. I'm going to give some background facts and trends, and I've been trying to read up a little bit and bring in some evidence from New Zealand. I'm a Canadian by birth, spent most of my career in the United States, but in many things I've been reading, I found that the comparison between New Zealand and Canada is sometimes quite apt. I'll talk about some of the issues underlying supply and demand for immigrants, a framework for understanding some of the impacts of immigration, a brief review of the evidence, and then I'll talk about some of the things that, in my opinion, we don't know enough about and probably should be on the top of the agenda going forward. So first question everyone thinks about is how many immigrants, and it's surprising how many people don't know the answer to that. If you do a public opinion poll in the United States, most people think it's about 40%. New Zealand currently has just under 30%, US around 14%, Australia around 30%, Canada around 22%. Here's a graph showing percent born outside the country for various countries very recently. This is 2018 or 2019 data. You can see New Zealand, I've highlighted here in the purple, is pretty far to the right. It has always been one of the more immigrant intensive countries. What's kind of surprising to many people is where the US sits, which is a little bit towards the center or even further to the left, in between Netherlands and Spain, which of course were traditionally exporting countries, even into the 1950s and 60s, people exporting countries. But that has all changed and really opened up a lot of differences in issues of immigration in lots of different countries. One thing that's very unusual about New Zealand, and shared to some extent but not as extreme in Canada, is that New Zealand is a country where people come and people go. And so this is a graph that shows the contributions of births and deaths, which is the red line. That's the natural increase in population, which is just under 1%. Recently has been lower because lower birth rates in many countries similar to New Zealand. The net contribution of immigration can actually be negative, as it was in the late 1990s, and again, just for a few quarters in 2012. It can also be quite positive, as it was in this graph in the 2017 to 18 period. So you can see that there's big swings, and a lot of this has to do with migration back and forth between Australia by New Zealanders, and a lot of it has to do with other factors. And so a question that's quite important and attracts a lot of interest in many countries is where the immigrants come from. That has really shifted a lot over the last 30, 40 years in the major immigrant receiving countries, so US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. the big four, that shifted from mostly Europe to Asia and the rest of the world. So right now in the US, about 30% of immigrants are from Mexico. Close to 20% are from different Asian countries. And then lots of older immigrants are from some of the more historical countries. In New Zealand, we see a similar pattern. Here's a graph showing data for the last 20 years or so of where the people in immigrants in New Zealand are coming from as a fraction of total population. So you can see UK, the traditional source of immigrants. I was actually quite interested to see that we could actually get the breakdown by England versus Scotland, in case anyone was interested in that, but I chose to group them together here. So that's a little less than 5% of the population. Australia, South Africa, another couple of percents. And then you can see China and India, Philippines are becoming a larger and larger share. The Pacific Islands, the three main Pacific Islands countries, Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, are pretty constant share, and then all other sources. So the big rise here you can see is from the Asian countries, particularly China, India, Philippines, a few others. Why does origin country matter? Well, one reason it matters is that the characteristics of those immigrants in terms of what they will do in the labor market and how they will perform is correlated with the country of origin. In US, for instance, Mexican immigrants are very poorly educated, and immigrants from India are extremely highly educated. So a typical Indian immigrant in the US has close to a PhD level of education. And of course, that's reflecting how difficult it is to come into the US if you're from India. A similar pattern, but not as extreme in New Zealand. So different across different groups. If you look at the fraction of people who have a bachelor's degree among natives, it's around 15%. For people from Australia or UK, it's around a quarter. For Asian immigrants, it's around a half. For Pacific Islanders, it's less than 10%. Origin also correlates with language, religion, race, and lots of other factors. And in the non-economic side or the cultural side of immigration figures pretty prominently. The characteristics of labor market performance also vary. This is a table from Stillman and Murray, tabulation from the New Zealand Income Survey, showing differences across different groups of immigrants and comparing them to natives. You can see if you look, for instance, at the top row that amongst men, Australian, UK, native immigrant men are fairly highly likely to have a job, whereas people from Asia and Pacific Islanders less likely. And the same pattern, maybe even more extreme for female immigrants versus female natives. Wages and other outcomes on average are not so different between immigrants and natives in Australia. So if you look at the real hourly wage, they're kind of similar. Now, this is data that's a little bit out of date from the late 90s all the way through to 2007. But in terms of incomes, immigrants as a whole are slightly lower income than natives. But you can see if you look, for instance, at the third row in this table, across that row, you can see some differences. So immigrants from Australia and UK earn substantially more than natives, which is probably not surprising given their higher education, and many people probably are aware of that. Whereas immigrants from Asian and Pacific Islanders tend to earn a little bit less. Other differences, and this is going to be important, I might have time to talk about it. Immigrants are relatively clustered in a few cities. In the US, Los Angeles and Miami, over 50% immigrant. London's around 37%, London, England. Sydney's around 45%, which is the same as Toronto and Auckland. And those are the sort of major immigrant hubs in the sort of immigrant world. And that tendency puts some pressure on local housing markets and also may accentuate some of the social tensions. Immigrants are also clustered in particular jobs. In the US, it's agriculture and healthcare are two big ones. And to some extent, I suspect that same pattern is true in New Zealand. I want to conceptualize a little bit why immigrants come to a country and then think about why they're demanded in the country. So on the supply side, it's helpful to think about two sets of source countries, poor countries and rich countries. From poor countries, think about the case of the Tongan lottery winners, which David Mackenzie has a very nice paper on. Most of the people from a poor country would earn more in New Zealand or most of the major host countries. The gains for them may be bigger if they're the lowest skilled people from those source countries, but there's still going to be fairly significant gains even for people with high levels of education. So in some sense, if you're thinking about who you can get to come to a country from a poor country, there's essentially an infinite supply. And the selection of who's allowed in is really determined by the host country rules and availability of jobs and so on. So that's, you think about it, there's a large supply from poor countries. From the richer countries, it's a much different situation. So if you think about who comes to New Zealand from Australia or Canada or United States, that's a very selective group of people. And they may be affected by differences in tax treatment. They may be affected by their desire to live in New Zealand and so on. So that, and there's also, of course, especially for higher educated people, some special rules for things like STEM graduates and so on. On the demand side, it's important, I think, to understand, and this is true of all the immigrant receiving countries, that there's a large low-wage sector that basically is too big to be filled, all the jobs there to be filled by low-skilled natives. There's not enough low-skilled natives. And so agriculture, hotels, construction, some of the basic healthcare services, childcare, all rely on immigrants. And this is true pretty much around the world in the richer immigrant receiving countries. And in that setting, the employers, landowners, consumers benefit from the availability of these low-skilled workers. And there's a lot of pressure to create special kinds of programs, including guest worker kind of programs and so on. There's also surprisingly demand at the top of the skill distribution in many countries, and I think this is probably true in New Zealand as well. There's a surprising shortage of highly educated workers, in part perhaps because a lot of high educated employers who'd like to employ highly educated people don't want to pay much. So professors' wages are notoriously low in many countries. Postdocs in science are notoriously low wages, and a lot of those jobs are filled by immigrants. So the insights of that analysis, I think it's important when you're thinking about immigration to think about both supply and demand and then the institutional rules. So there's different supply factors depending on where people are from. There's different demand factors depending on what the economy can use right now and what we've allowed to persist, what jobs we've allowed to survive and or regulated out of the market. And so the combination of the supply and demand factors in the US creates a very interesting pattern. I always describe it as we've a land of immigrant doctors and immigrant janitors. And I think that's probably true actually in New Zealand to some extent as well. So that creates a kind of a conundrum. On the one hand, we've got lots of jobs for both of those types of workers. They're coming from different places and it's creating quite a bit of diversity. So what you mean by the immigrant workforce can matter. How do immigrants affect the host country? Well, I always like to say that almost everyone's a Malthusian when they start thinking about immigration, even economists. And it's surprising how attractive the Malthusian idea is that more people lowers wages. However, it's important to keep in mind that larger countries do not have lower incomes. Larger cities do not have lower wages than smaller cities. In fact, on average, larger countries and larger cities have higher wages. And many countries, including at various times New Zealand, have tried to promote population growth in Canada. So we understand now, which Malthus did not, that the key thing in understanding the effects of an increase in population, whether it's driven by the Black Death or driven by immigration, is whether we can get a capital to keep up the supply of labor. And in the kind of general equilibrium models that a lot of economists use, including Nana et al. Have done a couple of GE type models of the New Zealand economy. The key thing that they're building into those models is the assumption that capital can catch up with population growth. Now, you might ask yourself, is that really true? And there's a reason to think about that because one of the drivers of population growth, and productivity growth in a neoclassical model is the rate of growth of capital per worker. So if you have declining productivity per worker, you might think, or slow growth, you might think, well, is that really driven because we haven't allowed capital to keep up with the inflow of labor? The historical record on that in the US is pretty strong. The capital per worker has been on trend for a very long time, doesn't seem to have been affected much. There's a really interesting case study of Israel. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a massive migration to Israel. And this is a data set that shows the rate of investment. The solid black line is the rate of investment in Israel. And there's a dotted line here, which is a set of other countries which kind of track Israel in the period from 1980 to 1990. And you can see, relative to that comparison, Israel had a massive increase in investment to accommodate that. And so that's one of the reasons why when people look at that inflow, they don't see very much evidence that it led to lower wages. And I would suggest that this is something that needs to be investigated on a case-by-case basis, and hopefully people will be bringing this up in the future in the New Zealand context. What about different skill groups? Well, if the composition of immigrants is about the same as the composition of the existing workforce, then the inflow shouldn't necessarily affect relative wages, but if it's different, it will matter, or potentially could matter, depending on whether you can expand the industries that use the group and supply more. And there's a bunch of different types of evidence that have been derived to study these effects. One is to look across cities or regions. Murray and Stillman have a study like this. I've got a couple of studies like this for the US. Another is to study big shocks like the Mariel boat lift or the arrival of Russian Jews in Israel. There's an interesting big shock a couple of times in the 20th century. The United States expelled huge numbers of Mexican workers, and so you get a reverse big shock. And a third way to do it is to do a model-based calculation. This is the kind of thing that I've seen in a couple of studies of a New Zealand context, where you set up a model, make some assumptions about what happens. If you take those models and assume that capital can keep up with labor, then the model-based evidence, the big shock evidence, and the cross-city comparisons all kind of agree that the effects of immigration on the labor market are pretty small. So let me briefly then, in my last couple of minutes, just talk very, very quickly about a couple of other issues. Other benefits of immigration, fiscal effects, outcomes of second generation, housing markets, cultural concerns. These are all quite important things. On the other benefits of immigration, it's, I think, becoming clear from studies in the US that immigrants bring some additional benefit apart from other things that you might think. And that's often associated with very specific characteristics of selective groups of immigrants. For example, a very high fraction of Nobel Prize winners from the US were immigrants. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of patent holders in the US are immigrants. That could differ from country to country depending on those supply and demand factors I mentioned before, whether those are particularly relevant in a particular context. There's also evidence that immigrants, for instance, are more likely to start businesses. I've been starting a project to look at that in Canada. And some of those businesses thrive. Many of them are small scale businesses that are just out of necessity almost. But I think it needs to be evaluated because if those factors are large enough, they could contribute to, over the longer run, to positive impact of immigration beyond that's calculated in conventional models. What about fiscal effects? Well, there's a little bit of evidence on this in different countries. The best study that's been done so far on this is a study of the UK by Christian Dussman and his co-authors, where they tried to actually allocate everything in the whole government spending system to immigrants and natives. Basic exercises for countries like US, Canada, New Zealand show typically that immigrants put in to the government coffers a little more than they take out. And so this is a chart based on data from Slack et al., which shows the contributions and to revenues and expenditures per capita for immigrants versus natives by years in the country. So you can see when immigrants first arrive, they don't contribute much in terms of revenue. For natives is the green line, if it's flat. But by the time they've been in the country for a longer time period, they tend to contribute more. They also don't get many expenditures on them, but they get more as they stay in the country longer. They get more likely to be entitled to benefits and so on. So in these kind of calculations, it looked like immigrants are a good deal for the economy. Now, that's a oversimplification because, of course, immigrants have children, and children are costly. And it's really important to understand if the immigrant children do well, that's good. If immigrant children do badly, that's bad. I'm not aware of much really solid research. I couldn't find much on second generation kids in New Zealand. But I did find one really interesting chart cited in a nice OECD study of New Zealand immigration by David Card in a 2019 study. And what he did was he gathered data from PISA scores, and he compared the PISA scores for children of immigrants versus children of natives by country. And in a lot of countries down in the bottom here, you can see like Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, there's a huge gap. So the children of immigrants are not doing very well in those countries, and it's causing a huge amount of trouble there. Up at the top in Australia, Canada, you can see immigrant children do better than the layabout children of natives. Not too surprising growing up in Canada. Many of my friends in college were actually children of Ugandan refugees and all kinds of people like that. US and New Zealand also looks like there's not a very large gap. So it looks like New Zealand is kind of performing reasonably well here. Maybe there's room for improvement, but not too badly compared to most other countries. And then finally, housing markets. I'm going to have to stop on that. I'm out of time, but that's a very controversial issue, and I'd be prepared to talk about that in the question and answer. So let me stop and take some questions.
Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. So what we're going to do now is we're going to be joined on stage by our panelists, and we're going to talk about your presentation a little. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Dave Murray from Motu. Dave is the co-founder of Motu and a senior fellow with us. His research interests include housing, productivity, diversity of the labour market, and also patterns and adjustments of the labour market. So if you'd like to join us, Dave, that'd be great. And we're lucky enough to have Julie Fry with us today. She's a consultant economist, and Julie's been working around migration policy issues since the 1990s, both here in New Zealand and internationally. And last but not least is Nicholas Green, and Nicholas has been 20 years in the public policy profession, and he's running the Productivity Commission's inquiry into immigration settings. So thank you all for joining us. David can hear you all in the audience and can hear you panellists as well. So perhaps if we kick off with about 5 minutes from each of you on whatever you like, really. And their mics are on, and I'll just hand it to whoever. You good?
Yep. Actually, I was wondering whether we invite David to present his last slides, because I'm more eager to. I think they would maybe even more valuable than anything that we would say. So, David, are you happy to go through the tail end of that presentation?
I could, sure, if you think it's a value. Can you see it? No.
Not yet.
Let's see if I share screen. Here we go. So this is a little bit of this is based on Dave Murray's work with Dean Hislop and one other co-author, unfortunately, whose name I forget.
Okay, that's enough then.
Which I'm sure that they are used to that. Here's the kind of issue. If there's a concept that economists love to tout, which is the so-called elasticity of supply of housing, which is when house prices go up, how much extra houses do you get? And if the housing supply is quite responsive to price, then when you get lots of people coming into a city or into a country as a whole, you can accommodate that, build all the new houses, and housing prices won't rise very much. And if it's not, then you can get a situation where when you get an increase in population, any kind of population, including immigrant-derived or other, you're going to get an increase in housing prices. And the Motu study that Hislop et al. Have done is suggesting that the elasticity of supply is a number like 1.2 in New Zealand. Now, interestingly, I did some homework and checked that out, compared that to a bunch of other cities in the US using the kind of a benchmark study that has looked at this issue in the United States by Alberto Saez. And the worst case scenario in the United States is San Francisco, where, as anybody who's ever visited knows, you can't really build another house. It's kind of like Wellington, only slightly bigger. You can't really build any more houses there because it's on hills and so on. So that has an elasticity of only 0.7. Pittsburgh is the same as New Zealand, 1.2. And then the really elastic supply places are Houston and Atlanta, where housing can expand really quickly. Now, here's the calculation I did. Dave's work with Dean suggests that if we get 10% increase in population in New Zealand, housing prices are going to rise by, let's say, something like 6.7%. Of course, this is there's some uncertainty around that, but that's their estimate. And I asked the following question: some people think we would really like to get that housing supply more responsive. We'd really like to reduce regulations and allow housing to be built more easily, maybe build roads more quickly and so on. So what would happen if we made Auckland into Houston? That was my kind of interesting exercise. And my calculation is if we were to be able to do that, then the 6.7% increase in housing prices you get from 10% more people would fall to 4%. So it would fall, but not enormously. And of course, the question, anybody who's ever visited Houston is not exactly the typical tourist destination. Many people have visited there, but they probably didn't go for the scenery. And they spent a lot of time on the freeway. So I think that's a kind of a cautionary tale. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, I'll pick up just a couple of points from what David's talked about. I'm going to have a couple of comments about labour market impacts in New Zealand, and then a little bit of comment on skills as we think about them in the immigration context. So for impacts, we've actually got a lot of New Zealand research on immigration impacts, and part of that is because the migrant levy was used to fund research. So there was sort of a line item for a particular branch of research. So we've got lots of studies, and in fact, my research record is a disproportionate number of migration-related papers, which may actually be slightly misplaced, because when you look across them all, the basic conclusion is, as David indicated for international literature, it doesn't matter as much as you think it might. So in positive, we tell ourselves a lot of stories about how immigration can help New Zealand solve problems of scale. So we can have scale of production, lowers the cost of local services, increased diversity, and a lot of stories we tell about spreading of new ideas, problem solving, ways that diversity of population can actually promote productivity, innovation. Also, we tell stories about connectedness, where it connects New Zealand to the rest of the world more tightly and overcomes some of the penalties for distance. On the negative side, I guess we've got the standard set of damage to wages of non-migrant workers, of employment rates, house price inflation. None of these things we can actually find strong evidence of either the very good stuff or the very bad stuff. So if you think immigration is horrible, it's not that bad. If you think it's going to be really great, it's not actually that great. There's one thing that came out, the graph that David put up of the population components, so the net migration and natural increase. Seems like the migration gets to be a very hot topic at times when the population growth rate goes above about 1.5%. So that was in the data I was looking at in about 1996, in about 2002, and then every year since 2013. So those are, and that's population growth. That's not just immigration, but that's the expansion. So it suggests there's some sort of absorption problems there. So overall, it's not as big as you think it is, which is actually something that the National Academy of Sciences in the US did this recent summary of immigration impact literature, and that was pretty much the same conclusion they came to. Okay, quick comments on skills. The basic insight of the economic models that David was talking about are that you want immigrants to be different from the native-born population, so that they sort of complement, they can do things differently, bring new ideas, allow specialization. The problem is when we go to look at those things for research, we translate skills into qualifications, and we say, does somebody have a degree? Which is an incredibly blunt measure of skills. And I think it's sort of also, it's a bit of a distraction that when we think about the diversity and the complementarities that could come from immigration, we often ignore the diversity within particular immigrant groups. And so, if you like, we're looking at the right issues and using very sensible proxies to get at them, but the story is much bigger than that. I think when it comes to policy, it also tends to be a little bit preoccupied with qualifications. And I think there's a general trade-off between going for general skills, trying to sort of get a good lottery draw by a migrant who is likely to have complementary knowledge, skills, interests, and make a contribution, and then on that selection side, or going for settlement, where you may have to put more effort into settlement policy. And I think there's a tension. I think immigration policy over the last few decades seems to have increasingly gone to trying to plug specific skill shortages. So this is a very sort of literal and engineering response to seeing immigration as a way of plugging specific gaps. And it seems like what we're trying to achieve is actually at a broader level than that. Okay, so I'll stop with those comments on impacts and skills. So pass over to Julie.
This is always the killer, following Dave on a discussion of immigration when he knows more about it than all of us in the room. I started working in the space in the early 90s as a treasury analyst, and at that time we had just moved from a country preference policy to a skills-based policy in New Zealand. And we were looking at things coming out of the US like Anna Saxenian's research about impacts in Silicon Valley, and we were looking at, through the next few years, David's work showing that impacts on locals weren't huge and that second generation children were performing really well. And at that time, immigration looked like it was a one-way bet. It looked like it had the potential to do amazing things in terms of productivity without any downsides for locals. And I think what we've discovered as we've gone through this period and done our own research is, as Dave says, the impacts are much smaller in the productivity space than we might have hoped. We don't have those transformational stories of lots of entrepreneurs starting Google and other businesses. We have a lot of nice people who've turned up, settled in, and contributed to our society, but we don't have that transformational story. And what I've come to think of is that immigration is really only one ingredient that you need to bake a cake. And so we bring in highly skilled people, and that's valuable. But if we don't have those kind of other contextual factors, we don't have a university of the caliber of Stanford sitting there pumping out research for decades ahead. We don't have some of those other embedded models of venture capital. Like we've tried to copy them, but we haven't naturally and organically built those up ourselves. So we have a situation where migration has been good, but it hasn't been great. And relative to your comment, David, what really struck me was talking about that sort of right-wing backlash in those earlier slides. I worked in the UK Treasury in the mid-2000s, and the discussion there was you couldn't have a conversation about immigration because it was just too contentious. And so there was this assertion and public stuff coming out of the Treasury at that time about how it was great for, like they would not track per capita growth, they would just track GDP. that was how they met their GDP forecast targets, was by encouraging more migration. But there was no allowance for any discussion of any of that uncomfortable stuff that you talked about. And so that got pushed under the rug, and what we saw was when you push things under the rug, eventually it surfaces. So what I think is important in the New Zealand context is both that we are honest about the impacts being smaller and less dramatic, both for productivity and for locals. I think that's important, but also that where people have concerns, we address them. Particularly in the housing space, there's been this long-running assertion that migrants are driving problems in the housing sector, and I think this recent COVID border closure has been magnificent, and that it has demonstrated we can generate massive rises in house prices without immigrants at all. So, I think it's helpful as economists and as policymakers to get people to calm down and see to translate what the research shows. It's not worrisome, but also to confront those kinds of commentary around negative impacts head on and really shut them down.
Right, I'm going to take this opportunity to shamelessly plug the Productivity Commission inquiry. We have an issues paper out. If you haven't already seen it, please do download it from our website. Let us know what you think. We really do welcome and value the submissions that come from the public. Can I just take the opportunity to thank Professor Card for his presentation. One of the things that we're trying to do with this inquiry, and one of the reasons why we were so happy to sponsor this event, is to promote debate based around empirics and evidence rather than priors and prejudice, and the professor's presentation has been very helpful towards that. I'm not going to go into the specific debates around New Zealand evidence because Julie and Dave know this way better than I do, but I thought I'd quickly touch on the sorts of issues that we're grappling with in the inquiry, and perhaps if we're lucky, the professor can give us some tips or some thoughts on how we might go about them. As both Dave and Julie have noted, a lot of the research into immigration focuses on the labour market impacts, wages, employment, etc., which obviously matter for distribution. But we have a wider remit. One of the main objectives we've been asked to look into is what migration policy can do for long-run economic growth, and that takes you to questions of productivity, how it can contribute to things such as innovation, international linkages, diffusion, specialisation, investment incentives. We're curious to know not just what it has or hasn't done, as the case may be, but what we might do differently to improve performance. Two other issues which are top of mind for us are the changing nature of migration. A lot of research has assumed or focused on permanent migration, but one of the really notable dynamics over the past 10 years has been a very large growth in temporary migration into New Zealand. And the question is, are temporary migrants different in their behavior, in their impacts, in the costs and benefits they bring to a community, and how might we go about investigating that? And the third big issue, which has been, I think, most cogently and compellingly advanced by Michael Riddell, who I think I saw in the audience over there, is the issue of absorptive capacity. Professor Card noted the case of Israel, where a large intake of migrants from the Soviet Union was accompanied by a big investment boom. Well, we've had large intakes of people and large population growth without that big increase in investment. And the question that's been posed is, is this population growth effectively crowding out investment in productive capacity? Is it putting a strain on the economy's ability to perform better? And that's something I think we need to get to grips with.
So it's great. David, I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on some of the issues that have been shared by the panel.
Let me share my screen again. I don't know if you can you see that?
Sure.
So these are some numbers on productivity growth in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, UK, US, and the OECD. And I was kind of interested in the question of what's happened to productivity growth. As was just said, there was a different periods, there's been surges of population growth, particularly in the 2015-16 period, there was a pretty big increase. You can see that it maybe looks like productivity dipped a little bit, 16, 17, 18, and then kind of was on it, looked like it was maybe on a rebound until, of course, the COVID period. But one thing that struck me from this graph was basically how similar these countries all are to each other. Maybe, Australia is a little bit more growth in some periods and a little flatter in other periods and things. But, the broad picture is many of these economies have some of the same problems. And so my thinking is to emphasize what everyone has said, that immigration may be a small part of something to do with productivity growth per capita, but maybe there's a lot of other things going on that fixating on immigration is either the bad or the good is a diversion from the fundamentals. One other thing I would say is that there is a point, if you were my mother, so more of a church lady, you might be noticing that when economists speak of immigration, they only speak of the effect on the natives. So it's a very peculiar non-utilitarian model where only people who count are the people currently in the host country. And it's probably relevant to think, depending on, again, who you are, immigration is enormously good for most of the immigrants themselves. And my family moved to Canada from Britain in the just after the Napoleonic War. And I remember once my uncle went to look up what was the story on them, and there was no records. They were so poor they weren't even recorded. So there's definitely long run gains for the immigrants themselves. And whether those should count or not is a really interesting question. How much those should count. Countries like Sweden are putting a huge amount of emphasis on that with their refugee policies, other countries not so much. And so that's something that you might want to think about a little bit. Another thing I was thinking about that might be relevant, I have one more slide. It's a pretty interesting slide that I was able to find or put together. Let's see if I can find it. It shows something that I was not aware of, which is a friend of mine. Canada was gone through many of the same, actually all of the same concerns that have come up today have come up in my conversations in Canada and discussions about immigration in Canada. So the shift in policy towards skills-based, which was kind of probably a failure. The fact that there isn't much evidence of the kind of entrepreneurship and incredible Nobel Prize winners or Sergey Brin's in a smaller country. All those things, same things have come up in the Canadian context. And a lot of Canadians, I think even sort of liberal thinking Canadians sort of say, well, do we want Canada to be, keep it kind of a preserve for our families and going forward in the future? I think that's sort of one model of utility you could have. And so here's a graph that I put together that's kind of interesting. This shows population density around the world. And I wasn't aware of this. New Zealand is actually at pretty close to the very bottom in terms of population density, but still quite a bit above Canada and Australia, about the same as Argentina and Sweden, below the world average. And so some people, I think, in the home country sort of say, we want to keep that part of our heritage and we want to preserve a less dense economy. But it's possible that would involve some sacrifice in terms of long-run economic growth, and maybe they would be comfortable with that. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, David. That's an interesting point to leave that on. So we'll open it up now to question and answers from the audience, and David can hear you all if you speak well into the microphone, including the panel. You can address your question to anybody in particular, David or a member of the panel, and you can answer popcorn fashion as well if nobody's been named to answer. So is there any questions from the audience at all? And if not, we'll perhaps continue with a bit of a panel discussion, but I have one here from Eric.
Thanks, and thanks for the wonderful presentations and discussion. When I look at the international literature, I conclude the same thing that you do. It looks like pretty minor effects one way or another. If we look at Perry's meta-study, it's probably on balance net positive for locals if we're looking at wages. The general assumption in New Zealand seems to be that New Zealand has just some different story, that we can't apply the international lessons here, and that we're somehow different from the rest of the world, and that evidence from elsewhere doesn't apply. I've tended to think that unless there's pretty strong evidence showing that there's something substantially different here that would cause us to get different outcomes, then we should probably rely on the international consensus in the absence of other things showing otherwise. What would your view be on this? Is there something particularly weird about New Zealand that would mean we should throw out the international literature? Or should we tend to view water that flows downhill elsewhere as also flowing downhill here?
Is that addressed to David?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, as the former president of the United States said, I think that question is a little above my pay grade. I personally think that the New Zealand evidence contributes quite importantly to the international evidence. I think a lot of my assessment that the effects are relatively small, and Dave Murray said and Julie said, I think not everyone believes them, and even if that was true, and that was also true of the New Zealand evidence, I think that evidence is valuable. And there's certain elements of the New Zealand situation that I think are pretty important. New Zealand is an extraordinarily open economy. It's a completely different economy than the U.S. economy, which is, essentially most people who are modeling it think of it as a closed economy. So I think that, for instance, really changes things. If you think about from the economic theory perspective, according to international trade theory, as it's usually taught to first-year graduate students, in a small open economy like New Zealand, wages don't depend on labor supply at all. It's all determined by international prices, and so there's I think it's quite useful to put it in context. I'll let the others pile in.
I've got one Dave Murray here again. The one thing that I think often gets missed or glossed over in New Zealand is we look at the international evidence, especially in the US, and think about migration as low-skilled migration, and ours is largely high-skilled migration. As David said, it's a little bit. What do you say? The janitors and the doctors. but a lot of the public discussion seems to have taken some of the rhetoric from about low-skilled migration from especially the US, which is not quite as applicable here.
I guess one of the questions I would have is around adjustment paths. So I'm thinking in particular the work by Perry and Sparber around, some of those adjustment mechanisms by where there are impacts on low-skilled locals, how those kind of play through. And one of their mechanisms they talk about is that locals upskill and move into higher quality jobs. And that I can see happening in an environment where there's not much by way of labour market protections. And I think an interesting question, which I'd like to see assessed here, and I don't believe we've done anything, is whether when you've got like very robust unemployment protections and working for families and those kinds of supports and quite a high minimum wage, whether some of the mechanisms that might lead adjustments like that to happen might get in the way. The other factor to think about also is like our education system doesn't do very well for people at the bottom end. So it's possible that some of the mechanisms by which these things adjust easily in an economy like the US without those factors might possibly be different here. No?
Just had one more thoughts on sort of over-education and whether we seem to have unplugged David from the screen again. Hang on. Just try and plug you back in again. Yep, you're back. Okay. I think on over-education, some work that Jacques Pote and Steve Stillman did looking at over-education found that, yes, immigrants tended to be working in occupations that weren't necessarily their specialty. The thing that really struck me about that paper was that was almost equally the case for New Zealanders. And so there's a less mechanical link between what qualification you have and which job you go in. So my sort of takeaway from that was that New Zealand workplaces sort of like generalists rather than specialists. And I think that probably does have some broader implications for what sort of immigrants we want, how much kick we get from the sort of specialisation that offers.
Nick, did you want to say something? No, you're good? So should we move on to another audience question if we have one? I think we have one up the back here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, David, and comments from the panel. I have a question about the impact of age on immigration, or the age of the immigrant. Does it matter in terms of the effect whether the immigrant is sort of young, perhaps coming for education, or old and has already acquired skills overseas and then brings those to the country?
I could try and answer that a little bit. So there's quite a bit of evidence in the Anglo countries. So this would include Britain, US, Canada. That people that are born in a country, that come to a country and go through, say, at least high school and college in that country, they're almost the same as natives in those countries. So there's and that's actually pretty important from a policy perspective, because many countries, including New Zealand and Australia and Canada and Britain, are relying on foreign students to finance our higher education system. And so there's a pool of very good students, or pretty good students, in the universities that are paying money to get educated in New Zealand or Canada or United States. Berkeley does the same thing. And those, we can essentially pick some of those students as potential immigrants. And they then are essentially, they've got all the network, they've got all the language skills, or most of the language skills. They've got a lot of the sort of human capital that we think would be desirable. And so there's pretty strong research. Actually, sociologists make a distinction. They say the first generation immigrants are people born abroad. Second generation are the children of immigrants. And they call the 1.5 generation if you were came as an immigrant but went to school in the host country. And usually what you find is the 1.5 in the Anglo countries is the 1.5s are about the same as the second gens. And in the second gens, as we've talked about, I'll do pretty well in the Anglo countries. They don't do as well in some of the European countries, and that's a huge problem for places like Sweden and Denmark, which have, as I mentioned, these big refugee populations, which are not doing very well in terms of assimilation, intergenerational assimilation.
Great, we have another question up here.
Thanks, Len Cook. I guess one of the alternatives to migration, of course, has always been having a baby. And what we know, do we not, is that for the last really 70 years, New Zealand has had on average about 60,000 babies a year, give or take about 5,000. Our population, however, over that period has ranged from 2 million to 5 million. When we look at some particular occupations, say nursing, where we've tended to require about 2,500 nurses a year, in the girls of my generation or a bit older, about 8% of them went into nursing, which was around 2,500 a year. Nursing is no longer quite a viable option when women can become judges, surgeons and other such things. And as a consequence, New Zealand women don't have a preference for going into nursing at all on the same scale. So and I just wonder how much the sort of demographic aspects, both of that huge difference in the role of babies now, plus the impact of preferences of people in the workforce have actually played a part that you can't really separate from the economic influences that you're talking about.
Is that one for you, Julie?
Thank you, Julie.
Honestly, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about the evidence from the US in the agricultural sector about how, as economies develop, people have options beyond farming, and that as we move from, as society develops, what people are able to do and work and what they want to do and work changes. And I guess there's a systems question about how we respond to that. Like, do we allow our locals to work and, in the case of New Zealand, get qualified and leave, because that's the other big issue here, or do we bring people in to do those roles? It seems that's the. Did you have anything to add, Dave?
No, it's sort of looking at the whole more a system approach, and I think the sort of population composition, age composition, and links with the training system as well, I guess is the other key element in that equation about how much do you want to have training system within New Zealand, trying to plug those, or immigrants plugging in. They seem like quite different system solutions to the same problem. David, do you have reaction to that?
No, I think that's about all I could say.
I think the only thing I'd add is that, for most of New Zealand's history, at least from the 1870s up until about 10 years ago, the vast majority of our population growth came from natural increase. And so the last 10 years have been quite dramatic in their change. And you've seen fertility rates drop relatively dramatically over the past 10 years. And the question is, well, will they go back up again? And if not, what sort of choices and trade-offs do we need to make?
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Arthur.
David, you touched on this but didn't really develop it much, is whether migration should be seen at a national level or at a regional sort of city level. As you showed in one of your slides, some cities are 50% migrants, and yet if you go to rural areas, they're very, very low in migrants. So I wonder whether it's necessary to interpret migration patterns as the effect that it has on certain gateway cities versus other cities versus rural areas, and then taking the dynamics of that through. So for instance, you get an immigration surge to Auckland, house prices go up by however much you want to quantify them. That allows New Zealand natives who live in Auckland to sell up and move somewhere nicer. And most places are nicer than Auckland. So, so there's a benefit, a wealth benefit to the natives there by having the immigrants concentrated there, and they then go to, natives can then move to somewhere nicer.
Yeah, I think there's I think it's important to understand that when migrants they do go to selective cities. So I suspect that a very high fraction of migrants who land in New Zealand end up starting in Auckland, possibly a couple of other cities. Same in Canada. Almost everybody goes to Toronto or Vancouver to start with if they can. And then that leads to some increase in population in those places. It's not like it ever completely dissipates. So there's some dissipation, but not complete dissipation. And that means that the characteristics of the arriving flow do have an effect on those gateway cities. So if they're highly educated or if they're non-white race or something, it is gradually changing those cities. It isn't necessarily one for one. Maybe over a decade, it would be for every 10 new people that come to Auckland, you might have 6 or 7 that stay or 5 that stay. I'm not sure the number, probably in some of Dave Murray's work, he's calculated that out, but there is a persistent effect, and that is what is being leveraged in some of these research designs, that immigration is selective and does change the characteristics of local populations and the size of local populations. I would say one other thing that I think it is kind of interesting. Actually, Dave, in his thesis research with Ed Glazer, I've been working on the same project recently. This is research that tries to ask why wages are higher in big cities in the United States. And one of the longstanding questions and puzzles in all of urban economics is the fact that across cities in the same country, the bigger cities always have higher wages. And is that a productivity effect? And if so, is that like an externality, or is it is that the thing that we could possibly leverage? And it's underlying some of the discussion that's come here before, where is New Zealand too small? Would it be better if we could get 3 big cities instead of just 1.5 or something? So that, I think, is still a fundamental question that is of great interest and probably not completely resolved. But those effects are smaller. Maybe a 10% bigger city might raise wages, just a few percents, or maybe not even 1%. But over the long run, that could matter to some extent. So it's not exactly as Julie said. It's not a miracle. It's not a disaster. It's well within the tolerance that we have and our ability to detect. But that's about all we can say about it, I think, without really bearing down and thinking about very long run outcomes that we really can almost not study empirically.
This is more of a sort of tangential comment and an opportunity to flag a pet peeve than a response to that. I've seen, certainly New Zealand government has tried this a little bit, and certainly Scotland is very keen on it, this idea that you can try and direct migrants regionally to places other than where they want to go. I just like, seeing as we've got quite a large audience in this room, to say it doesn't work, and please stop.
Thanks, Julie. Does anybody else have a question from the audience? Yeah, we've got a couple more.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up from a comment that Dave Murray made, where you said employers prefer generalists rather than specialists. And I thought this might have some implications for productivity, because what it means is when most of us are over-educated, given the range of tasks we are allowed to engage on here. And I've noticed this in academics. They do a specialist degree overseas and they come back to New Zealand and they're suddenly being asked to do all sorts of things that is not really in their specialism, and I suspect this occurs for many professionals as well. So it suggests we are too small in terms of our market, that we cannot provide the set of jobs for the people who are qualified to do. So I just want to put that out there is one of the features of being small, that we're not getting as much out of our human capital as might occur in larger countries.
Okay, just respond quickly to that. One thing, what I was positing, so I don't actually know from employers whether they do like generalists, but that was consistent with this lack of correspondence between qualifications and occupations. I guess I'd go back to Adam Smith on this, and that the degree of specialisation is limited by the extent of the market. It's not a new idea.
I think we might have time for one more question. I did see a hand up over there.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the point you made in one of your slides about an infinite supply of immigrant labour at the low skilled end of the labour market. And if you take that out of the sort of the perfectly competitive environment of the Lewis growth model, where that perfectly elastic supply of labour is absorbed into the modern sector at a wage that is the reservation wage out of the traditional sector, and think in terms of an employer of the importing country as effectively a monopsonous buyer, but acting in a market where the reservation wage of the migrants is well below the minimum wage or the prevailing wage within the buying economy. That's generating a surplus which has to be allocated in some way. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about the implications of introducing that monopsony element into a low-skilled labour market model of that sort.
Well, thank you. I do love monopsony models, and so that's a great opportunity. There is some research on this, actually. Some of it is modern research, and it's a kind of an old idea, actually, too. I think the practical version of this that is probably got a real strong element of truth is recent migrants are willing to live in bigger cities and what appear to be very high cost of living cities, and tolerate that high cost of living. So you get the phenomenon of a very small apartment with a larger immigrant family in it than a native family would have. And that's providing a supply of low-skilled labor in a city environment that wouldn't necessarily be there otherwise. And you could think of that as driven by this monopsonistic element, that that group of migrants wants to live in Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York City or Miami or something like that, possibly because of enclave connections to people that speak the same language, or possibly connections to employers that amount to a monopsonistic kind of element. So they're willing to supply labor with a lower real wage, and by real wage I mean the wage minus the cost of housing. And so that's generating a surplus along the lines that Dave was talking about for the natives in that city, because now there's an extra supply of low-skilled people who wouldn't normally want to live there. So I think that is an element of the benefit of immigration to natives. And some studies have tried to capture that a little bit. Studies of things like restaurants and things like that. Oftentimes appears a little superficial. Like, do we really care if there's like 5 kinds of ethnic restaurants versus 1 kind? But I think the spirit of it is in that direction.
So, do we have any other questions? I don't want to. Yeah, we do have a few more moments. I'll pass this back. Sorry again. Excuse me.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wondered if you guys had any insights or have come across any evidence of the relationship between crime and immigration. And coming back to Eric's point, I wonder if New Zealand is different to other countries internationally due to that relationship. For example, in Scandinavian countries, non-Western migrants are overrepresented in their crime rates and prison populations, whereas that might not necessarily be the case in New Zealand. So I just wondered if you guys had come across that relationship in your research.
So I've had a couple of PhD students who've worked on that much of their lives. A woman named Ann Peel, another woman named Kristen Butcher. In the US context, immigrants are less crime intensive than natives. And that's an example of backward assimilation. So second generation immigrants, unfortunately, get a little bit more of the criminality of the native population in the United States. And if we could figure out a way to prevent that, that would be very helpful. However, it's true that immigrants do commit some crimes. So in a way, it's an example of they are less criminally intensive than natives, but they do commit some crimes. So if you said, I want to absolutely lower all crimes, then you know, that would be an argument for reducing immigration. But per capita, they're a good deal. And so if you think about it as, I want to have low-skilled workers in this labor market. Unfortunately, low-skilled workers have, you know, their children and teenage kids are more likely to be the ones that cause problems and crime. And you're going to have a better deal if you have immigrants than natives doing that for crime. So per capita, they're a good deal.
Thank you, David. And I think on that
I think
note-
Eric's
please.
got a response to that.
Over to you, Eric.
Our report a few years ago went into the IDI and checked crime rates by native-born versus migrants, and New Zealanders were twice as likely to have been recorded as having committed a crime in 2013 as compared to foreigners, and you might reasonably expect that, where natives don't have to pass a criminal background check to be able to be in the country, and immigrants do have to pass a criminal background check to be allowed in, except for the ones that get deported from Australia.
And on that high note, I just ask you, David, is there any last comments you'd like to have in summary, or any of you on the panel?
I'm good. It's
good.
always good to end on a
Everybody's
joke
good.
about Australians.
We talked out. One of the reasons we booked this facility until 2 p.m. is to give you all the opportunity to meet and mingle and chew this over a little bit more. And it's great to have you all in the room today, and that's part of the reason we would like to do these seminars live. So please take the opportunity to hang around and meet each other if you haven't seen each other for a while. And again, thank you so much for coming, and we'll be having another one of these next month, so keep your eye on your inbox, and please let your colleagues know as well. We'll continue with this series throughout the rest of this year. So thanks again for coming. And thank you so much for David for your presentation. It's wonderful to have you Orwellian size up there. And thank you so much to our panel for going through the excruciating process of sitting up here on stage and answering those questions. We really appreciate it very much. Thank you so much.